Okay, today I'm going to talk about the Allegory of the Cave by Plato. So I'm going to introduce the main ideas of Plato. Plato is uh, probably, the greatest philosopher of all time. There's people disagree with that. Some say Aristotle, some say Plato. But anyway, the key to Plato's philosophy, the vision that underlies everything Plato did, that inspires him, is the vision of the allegory of the cave, which is the single most famous passage in the history of philosophy. If anybody knows anything, even if you don't know anything about philosophy, most people have heard about the allegory of the cave. And the allegory is, if you understand the allegory of the cave, basically you'll understand Plato's philosophy, what he's up to. The allegory of the cave is this, that there are prisoners who are chained. They're in a cave. It's a dark cave. The sun is out here. You go deep into a cave. The cave goes far in and eventually hits a wall. And prisoners are tied up in front of that wall. And they've been tied up that way since they've been children. And that's all they know about the world, are shadows. Behind them is a fire burning, and in front of the fire there's a wall, and men are walking back and forth holding up statuettes, that of artifacts, plates and bowls and pictures of horses and animals, trees, and so on. And they're walking back and forth, holding up these artifacts. And behind them is a fire, and the fire then will cast shadows on the wall, shadows of the objects that they're holding in their hands. The prisoners, all they know of the world are the shadows. They do not know that the shadows are caused by real objects. That's their world. At the beginning of the allegory, Socrates is telling this to Glaucon, who is actually the brother of Plato. And Glaucon, at the beginning of the story, he says, that's a strange image. Strange prisoners. And Socrates responds to Glaucon very simply. He says, they're like us. Strange images, prisoners bound, looking at the shadows. Strange prisoners. And Socrates says, they're like us. So the allegory of the cave is a picture of the human condition as Plato saw it. We live in a world of shadows, of illusions, very distant from the truth. The whole idea of Plato's philosophy is to bring people from ignorance to knowledge, from darkness to light. That's what Socrates did, and Plato, was inspired by Socrates. Anyway, so let me go on what happens. So somebody comes down from up here and liberates one of the prisoners, unbinds the prisoner. The prisoner at first resists because, why? Well, because he's used to the shadows. I mean, what you're used to, you don't want to leave. He's happy with the shadows. I mean, that's his life. That's his reality. And when he turns around, the fire hurts his eyes. So, I mean, it's very painful. So he doesn't want to, look in the direction of the fire. Eventually his eyes get used to the light. And now he can actually see the objects. The artifacts of horses and trees and so on that he only before knew in terms of shadows. Now he can see, so that's a real bowl, that's a real plate. That's what horses really, I thought the shadows were the real. Now I see that there's substantial things. There are really plates and vases and so on. So, so he's learned something, right? He's learned that what he saw before were shadows. eventually he's brought out of the cave. When he comes out of the cave, his eyes really hurt because of the sunlight. So he can't look around him. He can't look at the trees and the horses. So what he does at first is he looks in the lake at the reflections of the trees and the horses. Eventually his eyes get adjusted to the light, and then he actually looks at the trees and the horses and the animals. And so now he knows more than before he saw like statuettes of horses and animals and trees, not the real thing. Now he sees the real thing. And then eventually his eyes get adjusted to the light, and he actually can look at the sun. And he realizes now that the sun up here is the source of light, which allows him to see. And not only is it the source of life, it's the source of life, because the energy of the sun is what animates and gives life to all the creatures in the world. At this point here now, he starts feeling sorry for the prisoners. He says, wow, they live in a world of shadows, and they don't have any idea of reality. So he decides to go back into the cave, to descend into the cave, and to bring them good news. Plato's vision of reality is actually a religion. It's a philosophy of redemption, in a way. I mean, he sees the human condition as one of being imprisoned. He sees human beings as in need of liberation, of salvation, of redemption. And the redemption he's talking about is to move from darkness to light, from ignorance to knowledge of reality. So the prisoner who came out of the cave now descends into the cave. And as he descends into the cave, he's going from light to darkness. And just as when you go from darkness to light, it's hard to see because your eyes have to get adjusted to the light. The same thing happens when you go from light to darkness. If you've been in a bright room and then go to a dark room, you can't see. It takes time for your eyes to adjust. So when he comes down into the cave, he kind of stumbles around because his eyes are not adjusted to the darkness, whereas the prisoners down here, they can see good in the darkness because that's what they're used to. And they start laughing at him, and chuckling, and they have seen are shadows, so they're the experts of the shadows. They can tell you all about the shadows, and now he's used to the real things. So he doesn't really, he's not. The shadows no longer interest him, but they're the experts in the shadows, so they start laughing at him, because he doesn't really know much anymore about the shadows that they do. And eventually, when he starts, trying to get them to leave, Socrates says to Glaucon, "What do you think the prisoners are going to do to him?" And the answer is they're going to kill him. They don't want him there. And this is actually, it's obvious, I think, that what Plato has in mind that's exactly what the Athenians did to Socrates, because Socrates is what Plato has in mind in telling the story. He's thinking of the person who did come down and tried to bring the Athenians, to help them to move out of the cave. Socrates saw himself as a gadfly trying to wake people up and to bring them into the light. And he was rewarded with having to drink the poisoned hemlock, and he died as a martyr to philosophy. So anyway, that's the allegory, and this allegory is really the key to Plato's philosophy. The allegory of the cave is Plato looked at the world as being divided into two parts. First of all, you have the world of sense perception, the world that we perceive with our senses, sense perception, and then, so this is a world where we see horses, and we see people doing things, actions, and so on. trees. We see many beautiful things. I'm going to focus on the beautiful things right now because that's one of the keys to Plato's philosophy. We see many beautiful things. There are beautiful flowers, beautiful sunsets, many beautiful things. Beautiful pictures, beautiful people, beautiful horses, animals, beautiful music. The thing about the world of sense perception is that everything is changing. Nothing remains beautiful forever. Everything changes. What Plato believes is that there's another world. It's the world of what he calls the forms. And these are perfect. They're timeless, changeless, they don't change. And they're only perceivable. You can only see them by the mind. You can't see the forms with your eyes. So Plato believes that in addition to a world in which we see many beautiful things, there's a world of where beauty actually exists. It's beauty. It's not just an idea. It actually exists. It's what he calls a form. It's an ideal beauty that actually exists. It's more real. The forms are more real than the things of our world. And Plato believes that so this is the Platonic view. When you hear the word Platonism is the view that goes back to Plato, and it's basically the view that the world is split into two, the world of sense perception, the world of these eternal, timeless forms. This is the world here. Remember we talked about Heraclitus where everything is changing. This is the world that Heraclitus described, the world of sense perception. And up here is the world that Parmenides described. Parmenides said that everything is one, that change is an illusion, and that everything is one. Heraclitus said that everything is changing. Plato believed that Heraclitus and Parmenides, they both got it right and they both got it wrong. They both got it right in the sense that Heraclitus got it right when he says everything is changing, and Plato said that's true about the world of sense perception. That is true. Parmenides got it right when he says there's a world where things do not change. And Plato said that's true, but only of the world of the forms. The whole point of Plato's philosophy is to get people to move from here to here. Plato believes that we have a soul and a body. A soul and a body. The soul for Plato is immortal. It never dies. And in fact, Plato believed in reincarnation. So he believed that the soul, before it was born into this body, existed up here. So before we were born into this world, our soul existed up here. And we beheld the forms. We beheld true beauty. We beheld true justice. When we're born into a body, now the soul is now down here. And when the soul is born to the body, Plato believes that it forgets everything it knew up here. So now we live in ignorance. For Plato, the body is a prison of the soul. At death, the soul is liberated from the body and then will return to the world of forms. Let me give you an example from mathematics. Many mathematicians are Platonists. Let's say, for example, mathematicians, they draw, when they're working on their mathematics, they draw circles and triangles and so on, and lines, right? Plato would say that these circles and triangles are copies of these eternal forms. And if you think about it, it's true. You've never in your life seen a circle, because circles are perfectly round, and you've never seen anything perfectly round. You've never actually seen a line, because lines are perfectly straight. Plato believes that everything in the world of sense perception is a copy of these eternal forms, and it's because we have an idea of these forms that we are able to judge the things in this world as imperfect imitations or copies of what is up here. I'm going to continue with another video and develop this, but that's enough for right now, and I'll come back with the second part of this. Okay, so I'll continue this.